So I've been compelled to jump on to address the responses and discourse orbiting Laura Fryer with regards to this video that she released entitled "The Devs Did It Right, so why are Mixtape's reviews so broken?" And to be clear, I'm not about to come riding in like Sir David, White Knight of Jaffyshire, but that also is not to say that I'm about to jump on the dog pile with Smash JT and the others, needlessly over-ribbing Laura. Rather, I believe Laura's video and the broader Mixtape controversy merits further analysis and discussion, as it reveals an awful lot more below the surface layer of toxic fandom versus access journalism. So, if you haven't seen Laura's video, I'll leave a link below, and I urge you to go subscribe to her, listen to her, and pay good attention, as she has a lot of invaluable experience we can all learn from, one way or the other. Now, buckle up, as this is going to be a long video, I'm afraid, and it is about 1-something in the morning AM here, and I'm doing this in one take, so please forgive me if I do stumble. Now, I'm not using this video to review Mixtape specifically myself. I haven't played it, and I am very unlikely to, unless a hefty bunch of you are sadistic enough to pay me to force myself through it, and you can tell by that statement that I am not interested in the title at all. It's just not for me, and all the gameplay videos, reviews and streams have just further cemented that sentiment, and you'll see by the end of this video that my statement, "it's just not for me," is incredibly prescient to the details yet to be covered herein. You see, I'm the sort of person that can look at merely the USP or tagline of any given product and immediately see right through to the end point, Mass Effect being the common example I refer to, whereby people at Sega hated me for spoiling that franchise by predicting the exact ending or endings of the third game before the first game had even released. This doesn't necessarily make me psychic or some kind of genius. Rather, it speaks to how unoriginal and formulaic everything is these days. And much like Professor Zhang, I can collate the facts and evidence from history and spot the patterns and then derive future developments from it. In mathematics, this is basically the principle of calculus, and it works for pretty much anything you wish to apply it to, even chaos to some degree. The other component to this seemingly supernatural ability is research and the motivation to actually dig into the background of something before signing off on any deals, stacking one's reputation on, or investing your hard-earned cash into it, whether that's a multi-million-dollar gaming project, a several $1,000 hi-fi separate, or a reliable toolset for fixing your sink. So when Annapurna, a company owned and operated by Megan Ellison, daughter of centi-billionaire, current third richest man on earth, largest individual funder of a certain controversial defense initiative in the Middle East, new owner of TikTok, as well as Warner Brothers, and now Paramount by proxy of his son David, not to mention the former UK Prime Minister and master of the dark Fabian arts Tony Blair's best friend, Larry Ellison. Ooh, that sure is a mouthful and still doesn't cover all of it. I bet his business cards come in A2 sizes. Anyway, when the aforedetailed Annapurna announced Mixtape, I immediately knew that we were in for another subversive title with minimal mechanics, uncomfortably off-key artwork, questionable themes, and an ideological narrative wrapped up in iconic pop culture ephemera from decades gone by, and sold on having been created by a seemingly independent studio whilst conveniently ignoring or intentionally obfuscating the funding from one of the legitimately most concerning magnets of our era. You see, it has become a formula over the past few decades, and it is increasingly obvious to the public with each additional release of a title like Mixtape, or a TV show like Stranger Things, or a book/movie like Ready Player One. All of these franchises do exactly the same thing. They put minimal effort into anything other than the ideological narrative, whilst populating that narrative with self-inserts and then borrowing, in inverted commas, read stealing, elements from genuinely respectable IPs and properties and glazing it with nostalgia berries before paying or bribing access media to hype it to the moon. Lather, rinse, repeat. Always repeat, to quote Homer J. Simpson. So with that preamble, it may seem that Law of Fire just walked face first into a golden orbs web with this video. However, I have to be honest, this is in no small way aided by the harsh video from Jeff over at Smashed AT, which I saw the minute it was published. Now, looking at Laura's video and listening to what Laura has to say, well, she does imply at the beginning that there's any such thing as journalistic integrity and or trust to be further eroded than it already is. Now, Gamergate has been the jump-to retort to this inference, but guys, come on, I've covered this in last year's video, Grubby, A Tale of Two Jeffs. The video games journalistic media has been disingenuous at least since Jeff Gerstmann got fired for giving an honest review of Kane and Lynch. Or if you want to go back further, when marketing manager Dave Perry was supposedly a independent reviewer and gaming supremo on Channel 4's Games Master or in any of the various video game publications he wrote for. Gamergate is just a millennials version of these incidents, and because of the far greater access to information we have now, far more people have been awakened to the process by which these industries have always been run. So we can chuck the premise of an authentic gaming media out the window for a start. It's at best naive and at worst slightly disingenuous at this stage to suggest any 10 out of 10 scores are genuine from any of these major outlets. Laura posits that the review scores are based more upon nostalgia that the game invokes rather than the actual gameplay, and whilst this would land 20 years ago when we were both at our prime in the industry, it simply cannot now. Why? Well, take a look at the average age of the editorial staff at these outlets. Most of the people working at these outlets, writing and editing these articles, weren't even born when the John Hughes films espoused this mixtape's inspiration came out. And if they were, they would have been gurgling and eating paste. You see, John Hughes films came out last century. So unless everyone involved in these reviews is at least as old as myself or Laura, then they cannot possibly have member berries for stuff they couldn't possibly remember because they weren't even a twinkle in their daddy's eyes by then. Their parents were the ones living that rose-tinted aspirational goofball life promoted by Hughes films long before those parents settled down and spawned them. So perhaps it isn't member berries at all, but the yearning to have such a blessed childhood as many of us had when compared to what has become such an intensely dull, repetitive, technologically led, politically and ideologically charged and tangibly dangerous society for kids today. I mean, they're not even allowed to enjoy a video game without being proselytized to, so that yearning is actually very understandable. Next, Laura re-stresses that Mixtape was made by a tiny 12-person studio in Melbourne, but a small 12-person team funded by a centi-billionaire is still going to have far more resources, opportunities and leeway at their personal disposal than a 12-person team funding their spare room game development through 2 soul-destroying temp jobs on minimum wage per person. They'd have far more leeway even than an established developer like, say, Free Radical, who got gobbled up and shut down by Crytek on UK taxpayer money, allegedly. Or Criterion, who was screwed over by EA over milestones and deadlines, which itself is a story told so many times over, with so many development studios now lost to greedy publishers in the homogenization of the industry over the past 30 years. A good personal example. I once worked for the owner of belle-de-jour, who sold it to Scientific Games. So, yes, I then worked for Sheldon Adelson and Ron Perlman. But anyway, at his retirement party, I asked that owner how he had taken the business from manufacturing slot machines from a garage in a house on Jersey Road, Ostley, literally like 5 minutes walk from my own childhood home, to selling for inordinate amounts of money to a multi-billion, multinational global corporation. He immediately corrected me. No, he said. We weren't based there at all. It was just much cheaper to register the business as a sole tradership at that house. It avoided a lot of hassle, and I think you can garner what he meant by that. And so it transpired for our conversation that he was already incredibly wealthy and incredibly well funded before he even got started. He had an undisclosed and therefore unfair advantage over any competition in the field at the time. He retired happily to the Maldives on a triple platinum pension with enough legacy wealth to last 5 generations after him. Meanwhile, those of us actually making the product, slaving in the doldrums on absolute minimum they can justify paying, and being denied bonuses due to underperformance in the US, an issue that has followed me across most of the games companies I've ever worked for. Whatever it was you lot were doing in the US, it was affecting our livelihoods over here in the UK, and it still would be now if the games companies hadn't all shut down and shipped off to Bulgaria for those sexy tax breaks and minimal workers' rights. The point of all of this being that it's like the Iron Man Ironheart allegory. That show tried to imply that it was merely the incredible wealth that made Tony Stark Iron Man, completely missing the fact that it was his actual skill, intelligence, genius even, that allowed him to build that suit in a cave from a bucket of scraps. In the case of Mixtape, you have all the money on earth on hand via Megan Ellison's father to pour into a project from a studio that appears to be devoid of any true substance, the product of which is a 3-hour animated movie with occasional prompts, leaning heavily on member berries and access media hype. Much like Ironheart, you can have all the grant money, government funding and centi-billionaire backing in the world. Hell, you can even just straight up steal the property if you want. But without any deep understanding of the craftwork, world building, character arcs, gameplay mechanics, you're just going to end up with a formless, massless mess floating aimlessly like a turd in the wind. And so then Laura drops what I believe to be her first truly contentious comment. She believes that the devs did it right. She expresses her impression that the devs were truly passionate about what they were making, but then immediately recognises that the developers themselves identified the project more as a movie than a video game, which if you've ever played any movie franchise video game or conversely watched a movie based upon a video game, attempting to approach either one from the creative or productive direction of the other is a fool's errand. I'm sure there are a few occasional exceptions to this. However, they are rare. Take the Doom movie with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. That isn't a good movie because the first-person shooter scene. It's a good movie because it has a really solid story based upon Tom Hall's original Doom Bible, peppered with Easter eggs for the fans like the names of the Marines or the character of Dr. Carmack, and a fantastic performance by Carl Urban. The first-person shooter scene merely tops it all off and is short enough to merit re-watching the movie just for that sequence. Sure, it took its knocks at the time, but Doom does actually really stand the test of time as a schlock sci-fi action horror. The problem with Mixtape seems to be that it has no respective endearing factors like those I've just highlighted, or at least none that resounded in any positive way with the audience. Emotional resonance was their goal. And there it is, clear as a bell. Mixtape is all about the feels. And with the developer in the B-roll Laura's using, I can't help but succumb to a moment of ad hominem, for which I do apologise, however is actually relevant to my points as you'll sure hear. I distinctly get the feels of a painfully hip post-millennial who idolizes Kurt Cobain like the standard generic 90s teenage MTV generation insert. It looks like he googled definitive 1990s teen icons and ordered this exact Kurt Cobain outfit specifically for this interview. He wouldn't go amiss in the background of an episode of Daria, which also belies their ignorance. As I highlighted earlier, John Hughes' most memorable work largely resides in the 80s, with titles like 16 Candles, The Breakfast Club, Weird Science, Ferris Bueller's Days Off. In fact, all of his iconic coming-of-age movies to which Mixtape attributes its inspiration are expressly 1980s movies. It reminds me of when Austin Powers came out and my parents objected strongly to how much it relied on elements from the 1970s rather than the 60s, despite supposedly being set between the 60s and current day. As I highlighted then, it's because the writers were writing from a retrospective based upon their preconceptions of the 60s, based upon the media available to them at the time, having not actually lived through those decades themselves. They built everything as if it were a concept album. So now the developers are approaching this like a Rush album. I thought they were approaching it like a movie. And this doesn't sound consistent from the outset. It sounds more like an inception project of a video game within a movie, within a concept album. Perhaps these guys would have been better off going into the manufacture of Matryoshka dolls. In describing their horizontal slice, the dev reveals that they are really working backwards from the end point to the start of the project, almost as if he thinks he's a Michel Gondry level director who can abstract a very technical and impressive video from music supplied to him by the various artists that he's made music for. Thing is, Mixtape is a video game, and this guy is no Michel Gondry. The way this may have worked in the past is that a small indie team would work on a title. As they worked, they would listen to music on headphones or even across the workspace if they're all metalheads, like, I don't know, id Software, for example, right? Then, as they got the actual gameplay, mechanics, story, characters, assets, and all that together, they would start looking to form the soundtrack. And often that would come from the pool of music the devs had been listening to throughout the development. Now, if they had the resources, they'd see if they could license music that they'd been listening to, or even ask individual musicians to work on the soundtrack. More often than not, for indies though, they would either have an in-house musician or a trusted third party who would produce a soundtrack based upon prompting from the devs, which would often be in the form of their mixtapes taken straight from their Walkmans or their boomboxes. In the case of Doom, they basically made a legally distinct series of covers of the metal tracks they'd all been listening to while making the game. The point being, the music usually comes later in the development pipeline unless it's expressly a music game like Guitar Hero or whatever, or perhaps even an experimental game using music as the basis of geometry generation, level generation, asset generation, etc., a few of which I've made myself. That's not to say music cannot inspire a whole game or narrative. Indeed, one of my projects Out of the Dark was entirely inspired by the song In the Shadows by the Rasmus. However, that was just a starting point. From there, I constructed a complex narrative with a strong bond between two key characters trapped in a sci-fi incident based in CERN, for which I spent considerable time researching and developing environment, atmosphere and mechanics based upon both the setting of a ruptured active super collider and the unusual physics that may surround such an event, and the elements of watching and waiting in the shadows for the right time. But what the developers of Mixtape seem to have done is taken a mixtape of generic popular music from roughly the era of the 90s, doesn't have to be too accurate, and then tried to generate Feelz moments based upon each track and paste them all together in some sort of final teen summer camp scrapbook. Which brings us to the tongue thing. I think Laura's very on point here, and so is an excellent eye she has for USPs within any given product. Just like the chainsaw gun did for Gears of War, the tongue wrestling has garnered Mixtape a healthy amount of publicity, and any publicity is good publicity within reason. And just looking at the footage, yes, I understand that uncomfortable feeling and recognise the uncertain nostalgia of our first Frenchie, as I'm sure all of us do, but without any compelling build-up or run-off surrounding it, it may as well be that flash game on Newgrounds where you put the frog in the microwave. It's uncomfortable, it gets a reaction, but ultimately it's a disposable novelty for a very short time. You see, Gears of War didn't hinge upon the chainsaw gun alone. It was backed by a really solid gameplay loop with excellent mechanics, compelling characters, engaging storyline, and an emerging new Unreal Engine, for better or for worse. Mixtape, again, doesn't appear to bear any of these benefits if the feedback is to be believed. Moving on, Laura again mentions how this is a tiny 12-person studio in Melbourne, not a 40-person team like Double Fine, who I've actually worked with myself and can verify are far from an indie developer by its true definition, the definition of which we shall come on to later. But as Laura says this, we see wannabe Kurt Cobain strolling around a very nice looking studio, kitted out with thousands of dollars worth of high-end equipment, wearing his customary David Lynch blue velvet t-shirt that declares loudly that yes, he does indeed know how to use Google to research a time period and Amazon to add that bad boy to the basket with yet another pair of Cobain-style women's sunshades. Now, having good friends who live there, I can say fairly confidently that the rent alone on that high-end Melbourne studio is likely way beyond the resources of most true indie developers out there today. Laura states that the devs scoped correctly and then drops that they got money up front from Game Pass and their publisher, meaning they've very likely already made their money back, if not they will do soon. So, really, this is a zero-risk operation for the devs, a pure vanity project, as they've scoped so low that the initial investment from Game Pass and Annapurna has covered almost all of their costs, to the point they're almost already in clear profit. I can't imagine such a plum deal for your average indie developer. I mean, how much are they paying each of that 12-person team? Let's pretend that's a low figure like, say, $20,000 a year each. That's almost $250,000 just on salary. And don't forget there's taxes and contributions and insurances for each of those team members. The game was first revealed during the 2024 Xbox Showcase, so that's roughly 2 years, which makes a minimum of $500,000 just on the staff, at $20,000 a year, which I believe is a massive underestimate. Then, add on that lovely studio in Melbourne, the utility bills, the hardware, network and maintenance, and of course, don't forget wannabe Kurt's never-ending supply of 90s pop culture ephemera. What about marketing, promotional tours, flights, limos, that massive box of bribes they sent out to all their payrolled access media influencers? The costs all add up to Mixtape having a budget within the $1 million+ region at least. Production costs alone are estimated at about $5 million at best guess. Most indie developers would have a heart attack if offered that sort of money, pretty much up front, to spend 2 years developing a game, and they'd also likely recover from that heart attack, sit down, and make a much longer, more detailed, and more inspired fun game than Mixtape is reported to be. So it is here again that I feel Laura may be inviting some ire, inferring that Beethoven and Dinosaur are a green grass tiny 12-person upstart team punching above their weight class. She does, however, immediately follow that up by reinforcing that the devs correctly scoped the game for their target audience, which is actually a very ironic statement, given the developers must clearly have known they were making this title for the most niche of niche market, yet were being funded to the tune of millions of dollars to do so. So, from that perspective, perhaps Mixtape is just as successful as it needs to be, given that their target audience was post-millennial video games editorial teams with deep-seated yearnings for the seemingly better childhoods, movies, music and franchises their parents had enjoyed in the 80s and 90s. And that's exactly the group that has been singing Mixtape's praises for access, goodies, and virtue-based clout. And no, I'm not merely being facetious for comic effect. Laura then continues to point out the massive disconnect between those reviewers' scores and the public feedback before comparing it to Heavy Rain. Now, I definitely know more than a little about this, as I had presented a seminar at Thames Valley University about the emerging notion of transmedia properties, interactive movies, and how that was being driven by large at that time by video game development, particularly with the advent of large data space media such as Blu-ray and HD DVD. So naturally, when David Cage came along with Heavy Rain, I got it. I understood what the concept was, and as Laura points out, the game pretty much nailed the concept throughout and provided a perfectly enjoyable experience for those of us who knew what to expect going into the game. I mean, my friend Dominic and I were playing Omicron Nomad Soul and Fahrenheit Indigo Prophecy back in the day, so we knew what we were getting into with Heavy Rain. Problem was, the public didn't really engage with Heavy Rain as they had been led to somehow expect it to be more in line with the other games dominating the market in 2010, your Gears of Wars, your Uncharted's, and so on, by whatever means that happened. When they booted up what was essentially an interactive movie, they didn't get it. But as Laura says, it was still selling millions of copies, and I would wager that many more people would enjoy it retrospectively today, even if they had dismissed it at the time, now that the hype is gone and it can stand on its own for what it's really intended to be. I'm not sure one can make the same argument for Mixtape. You see, Laura is taking an average 15 to 25 hour minimum completion time title with deep interleaving storyline, cinematic direction, and for the time pretty leading edge graphics, and all driven by an exotic new broadband processor by an auteur like David Cage and his team at Quantic Dream, who by that time had two similarly conceived titles under their belt that stepped across generations of both console and PC. And comparing that to an average 3 hour to complete game made by a 12-person team of Aussies, led by someone who's more concerned with looking like Kurt Cobain than one should be when helming a multi-million-dollar project funded by one of the richest men in the world's daughter. And whereas Cage, for better or worse, whatever you think of him, actually did earn his auteur status through the work, and perhaps more importantly, the very real tangible risks attached to bringing those previous titles to market, arguably defying a new subgenre of his own in the process. Well, Kurt here has just jumped right on in at the top floor with all the funds but none of the liabilities and one middling title under the studio's belt. It really is a case of apples and oranges, but again, I'm not criticising Laura for her take here. After all, we're all looking in from outside, and many people don't understand anything really of the interior workings behind Mixtape or Annapurna Interactive. So for all we know, that studio is full of second-hand gear, it backs onto an industrial wasteland, and wannabe Kurt just happens to shop at the most immaculately stocked 90s Nirvana-themed thrift shop. But I somehow doubt it. I think we all do. And that's why no one's buying the tiny indie developer story. Up to this point, everything presented to us about the developer stinks to high heaven of nepotistic advantage over creative authenticity, and that is what really grinds people's gears. Where Laura may really have hurt herself a whole heap more comes up next, whereby she admits that she was the producer on Crimson Skies who eventuated the introduction of skipping to the next level if you weren't good enough at the game. Now, let me preface what I'm about to say for a moment. I have great respect for Laura, as we've been contemporaneous workers within the same industry over the same period, though working on our respective rivals' teams. My primary allegiance being PlayStation, Laura's being Xbox, and with each of us at polar opposite ends of the spectrum, Laura in the upper executive branches, and myself in the senior lead management trenches at the bottom end of things. The fact that we fundamentally disagree on some key points is what has always driven me to listen, absorb and comprehend Laura's perspectives to better understand the full breadth of our industry and all its eccentricities. The additional fact is we actually agree on a vast amount that never ceases to surprise, enlighten and motivate me, as it seems we've both had very similar experiences at our opposing ends of the spectrum. We have both seemed to be the ones crying out for reason and sanity amongst a sea of industry tourists and bad faith actors in many cases. But Laura, you released this video just as I was going to bed after a long day and a late night, so I popped it on to listen to before sleep, and I had a visceral reaction that almost compelled me to get up again right then and make this video. I relented though, and you know why? Because I do respect Laura very much, and Laura has prompted that visceral reaction many, many times from the day she joined Xbox to, well, 3 days ago now. Does it anger me? No. Do I feel the need to scorn her and fill her X with comments? No. I prefer to distill, matriculate and ruminate a little before offering my insignificant views upon it. And my view in this instance is that I'm not surprised. And I say that with the best of faith, as don't forget, Laura helped lead Xbox to where it was before Microsoft pivoted to micro-monitoring of their users' every movement and action with the Xbox One, and the 360 was a dominant juggernaut of success in its day. But as my viewers will know, whenever I'm asked at what point did the industry change into the spiraling mess it is today, and I frequently am, I resoundingly stand by my response of the day Microsoft entered the console market. You see, they've always targeted the lowest common denominator with a final goal of turning the living room console into a fully functioning Windows PC, with all the monitoring and data collection demons that entails. Laura has in fact previously relayed this exact sentiment in her own videos, recalling that Bill Gates actually wanted full-fat Windows running on the OG Xbox, and they basically had to reality check that fool by just producing the OG Xbox kernel to actually work, and not telling me it wasn't full-fat Windows until they finished showing it off to his approval. I remember this at the time. It was hilarious how disconnected Bill really is from anything he has ever been in the face of. And as I said in last year's video regarding the Real Game Awards, they don't want your praise or your money. They in part want your data, your biometrics, your spatial data, your environmental data, your spending habits, your eating habits, and so on and so forth. That's why Microsoft entered into a deal with PrimeSense, a former military contractor for certain Middle Eastern interests who may or may not also be funded to the maximum degree by a certain father of a certain woman who happens to be the owner of Annapurna, for the sensors that made the Kinect. So, unfortunately, as upfront and honest as Laura is, she literally laid in the den of a lion with regards to Microsoft. And I genuinely believe that Laura is somewhat oblivious to most of this, particularly as she left Xbox in 2009, a whole year before Kinect shipped, and by that time she had long since been shifted into the publishing team in an effort by Phil Spencer to keep Laura in the business, but also to keep her relatively out of harm's way. It was only through her video wherein she relayed the absolutely horrific experience at a game show that led to that aforementioned move into the publishing team that I realised the moment she described. That thing right there was likely the first insight Laura had of the deeply disturbing malfeasance that permeates the industry. You see, culturally, Xbox has represented the MTV generation of console gaming, and not the supposedly cool 80s music television generation people have rose-tinted memories of. But the degenerate post-2000 P. Diddy 16 and pregnant catfish MTV generation, they even launched their console on MTV. It says everything anyone ever needed to know about Xbox at the time, and it still does so now. You see, Microsoft weren't ever looking to appeal to the thin slice of market that had occupied the gaming space up until then. The nerds, the geeks, the actually ostracized kids at school. No, they wanted everyone on board, and particularly the jocks, the cheerleaders, the tourists, the teeming masses. Through a combination of Peter Moore's proven tribal divide and conquering marketing methodologies, extensive tie-ins with MTV, and consistently lowering the bar for entry to what was frequently referred to as the walled garden of first-party platform compliance, Microsoft sought to reduce the gaming market to the lowest possible denominator, thereby easing their ability to dominate it. Consequently, the culture surrounding gaming collapsed. There's a reason Halo 2 lobby chat is a powerful, never-ending meme. Whereas before, online communities had been, by definition of the technology at the time, hangouts of limited numbers of very dedicated gamers, now any old Raiders fan with a six-pack and a bad attitude was jumping into your TeamSpeak and slagging you off 6 ways from Sunday with a mouth like a Dutch sewer. Before long, it was 8-year-olds teabagging your deceased Spartan in Halo 2 while questioning your mother's sexual proclivity while cursing you with a haze of swear words. But how did all of these tourists who previously had no interest whatsoever in beating their head against the wall of Kid Icarus on the NES until completion, for example, suddenly find themselves compelled to join in with this questionably fun pastime? I think you may now see where I'm going with this. You see, by making concessions like having the option to skip a level because you cannot complete it, the bar is then being significantly lowered for anyone trying to get through that game. By applying this ideal across the board, across ever more games, and to an ever greater extent, the bar is continually being lowered to grant further access to yet more people, whether they should really be there or not. This is not encouraging determination, motivation, or ultimately satisfaction. This is merely maintaining attention while something plays out before a person. Actually, it's robbing them of their own agency. I have seen this firsthand with Mini Driver. Case in point, I completed Kid Icarus, Bionic Commando, and Super Mario Bros. 1, 2, and 3 on the NES with my friend Dominic, and it was hard. Yes, Nintendo hard. Like, no continues, no codes, no save states hard in some instances. It took us literally months, if not years in the case of Kid Icarus, to beat those games, but we beat them nonetheless, and the immense feeling of satisfaction was overwhelming. I'm sure many of you have either experienced it yourself or seen old VHS camcorder videos of kids literally losing their cookies over beating a boss or a whole title on those old cartridge consoles. Not only did we get that feeling, but we also overcame that struggle, learned the benefit of determination and motivation, developed skills and experience for the next game, or in my case, my later career, and even justified the outlay of money for that cartridge to parents who were far more savvy to how much value may be attached to the latest craze of video games consoles at the time. They weren't keen for a con back then. It's why Mini Driver now believes I'm some sort of Superman gamer, because I rattled through both New Super Mario Bros. Wii and U in single 6-hour sittings, each game finishing up with 99 lives and all levels completed. However, I'm no god of gaming. Instead, the games have become far easier, so much easier that by the time Mini Driver was playing the more recent Mario entries, they largely got through the games using either the White Tanuki or worse, do it for me, Luigi. It meant that when presented with an actual challenge, Mini Driver was immediately asking if there's a workaround, a skip button, or a cheat to get past the block. It was only when encountering the Astrobot Master Challenge that Mini Driver actually sat down and determinedly played through an hour and 45 minutes of grueling gameplay to legitimately complete it. And yes, there were tantrums. Yes, there were tears. But in the end, with a little reassurance that I was just as frustrated at Kid Icarus or Mario 3 when I was a young'un, they sucked it up, took a deep breath, and buried that sucker. And you know what? We'll never hear the end of it, and that's great, because that is a memory that shall live forever in all our hearts and minds as a family, and Mini Driver's family to follow as they share these games with our grandkids one day too. I feel damn lucky for that, as since then Mini Driver has been going back over games that seemed impossible before and 100%ing them, because now they know that feeling of euphoric satisfaction in overcoming something one once thought impossible, striving to improve, to beat it against all odds. But I worry to think of what may be if that wasn't the case, if Astrobot hadn't come along at just the right time, with exactly the right balance of appeal, fun, gameplay and difficulty to compel a kid enough to stick up an hour and 45 minutes of repeated Twitch platforming torture, just to have the satisfaction of telling their mates at school that they beat it legit. No cheats, no workarounds, no skips. Because at the end of the day, anything else is just fronting. And Xbox has always been fronting. And this story that I've just told, I'm sorry to say, Laura, and I think you know this by this point, it may not have been this way at all. If you had just heeded the Glider Gnome's words and accepted that Crimson Skies was not for you, and let it stay for the players, /ironic tone. In real life, if you want something really badly, you have to work for it. There's no reward if there's no work put in, and there's certainly no reward if everyone's a winner. Laura's justification of wanting to progress the story so badly that a skip button was absolutely needed fundamentally shakes her credibility somewhat for a lot of people, and this was actually what disturbed me from my near slumber when Laura initially published the video 3 days ago. By Laura's argument, I would never have learned how the stories of Police Quest or any of the King's Quest games played out, because they didn't have a skip button. Laura further compounds her argument for the skip button by highlighting that they, meaning Microsoft, already had Crimson Skies customers' money by the time they'd be playing it, so why bother supplying a compelling product that presents a reasonable challenge in exchange for the reward of an engaging storyline? I'm sorry, I mean, why have those customers bang their heads against the wall if they wanted to just enjoy the storyline? A storyline, one might add, to the first video game loosely based upon a fairly niche board game that focused on early 20th century aerial dogfights in an alternate timeline which, to all intents and purposes, had no broader establishing context other than what came in adverts and articles at the time, thereby not presenting as something with any sort of deep storyline of the likes of, I don't know, Homer's Odyssey, say. One would have to posit that the majority of people excited for an arcade dogfight flight game set in an alternate 1937 with no major franchise attached to it were neither seeking nor expecting a deep tale of skybound heroism, perhaps something more like a modern 3D engine take on a classic arcade game 1942. Whatever the case, the statement that they already had the customer's money, so to hey with it all, does come across as not only somewhat callous and cynical, but also absolutely classically Microsoft. Laura then uses playtests as an example, where some people will excel at the game whilst others won't, and even very good players will get completely blocked on certain levels. Now, instead of identifying this correctly as a problem with a game's balance, particularly at the higher end of the excellent player's own capability, and fixing that, Laura reduces it to a workaround, a skip, a cheat basically, and then states that the debate over this is not new, which is easy to say when that debate all but didn't exist before Laura came along and helped normalise it across the industry with this decision on Crimson Skies, which would only serve to encourage others to do so, particularly with such a decision coming out of the biggest and most anticipated new console platform on the block. That one decision pushed for by Laura way back on Crimson Skies serves somewhat as a self-admission of one's own hand in where we are as an industry today. And I do actually commend Laura for confidently owning up to that. It reminds me of that scene in Total Recall where Cohagen is explaining the lengths to which he has gone to construct and preserve the situation between Quaid and Quato to his liking, with his only fear being that it will one day come crashing down, before telling an oblivious Victor that he's the one making it happen. And perhaps poetically, Laura's premise serves as the perfect allegory for Mixtape and both its developers and its publisher Annapurna. From all outward appearances, they just pressed the skip button on everything, it seems, and ended up with a fully packaged title with all the trimmings served up on a plate in under 2 years, fulfilling their vanity project with apparently few to none of the struggles, hardships, risks or liabilities traditionally associated with true indie game development. Just one of wannabe Kurt Cobain's finely curated period-accurate outfits likely costs more than your average indie developer's entire food budget for a month. Just one of the graphics tablets seen in their studio costs more than a second-hand car in many places. The entire premise with which the developers conduct themselves, at least in the public capacity, gives off the air of upper middle to upper class, privately educated kids of rich folk cracking out their half-baked idea based on coming-of-age movies by John Hughes, who they've heard is a cool retro director. Laura starts wrapping up her video by highlighting that the huge disparity between games journalists and actual paying customers' reviews of Mixtape is eroding a trust in games journalism that is at an all-time low. As highlighted at the top of this video, that trust eroded long ago, and actually Laura's video may have unwittingly shaken the gaming audience's trust in Laura herself. As has been said many a time in recent years, when you try to appeal to all, you end up appealing to none. And once you lower the bar, it is far harder to raise it again, particularly when the profit model is based upon minimal input, maximum gain, appealing to the lowest common denominator for maximum possible market reach, prioritizing endless cash hole live services, and using mildly modded off-the-shelf mid-level PC components at lowest possible cost for highest possible margins. The fact that Laura pushed for the skip button is not the only highly questionable decision that she has relayed in her videos. Indeed, she has admitted her mistakes on many occasions, whilst also blissfully missing why decisions she or the broader Xbox group as a whole made over the years may have had a significantly negative and irrecoverable impact on the industry in other occasions. There is no argument that Microsoft's influence and power over the games industry over the past 2 decades has absolutely devastated not only the console market, but everything else from quality standards to the very culture and community around gaming, tearing down the walls to let in the tourists and charlatans, and fomenting an environment where a game like Mixtape could even be considered for production, let alone greenlit with money up front, sight unseen, proof unproven, and forced into the public's hands through Game Pass. They valued this title so little that they'll happily give it away through their subscription service like so much disposable Netflix trash. Again, they're proving that they don't want your praise or your money. They want your attention, your compliance. They want you to accept ever more extreme creeping progressivism. They want you to think like they do, act like they do, value yourself and others as little as they do, serve not but the mighty dollar, and do not but consume product, then get excited for next product. Laura draws a comparison to Hollywood and Rotten Tomatoes, with critic scores consistently being 40 points at least off the public reviews. And this is a valid comparison, as both film and games, but also TV and music, they're all succumbing to the same minimum effort, maximum ideology, pay-per-review pipeline. Why do people think that might be when both Annapurna and the majority of Hollywood is now owned by the same family, the Ellisons? Indeed, the circle of ownership of the major gaming publishers is getting ever smaller and being absorbed by, again, the very same families such as the Ellisons and the Kushners. So when the same people that own the game's publisher and fund the developer also own or have holdings in the majority of the gaming press outlets, TV outlets, and film outlets, is it any surprise that those outlets are going to sing the game's praises with 10 out of 10s when their jobs and access literally depend on it? I don't know, ask Jeff Gerstmann. I'm sure he'll tell you all about what goes down when you choose integrity and honesty over money and access. He learned his lesson though, and doesn't make much of a fuss of it to preserve what network he retained after being booted from both GameSpot and now Giant Bomb too, by the same people in both instances. It should be noted. You see, it's a mafia racket really, La Cosa Nostra of media. You play the game, say the right things, and one day you'll be a made man, but cross them and poof, you disappear. Now, Laura's Oscars comparison is an interesting example. Over time, the Oscars has lent so heavily into the Hollywood ideology that Laura and most any sane person can no longer relate to it. However, Laura then states that Jeff Keighley's Game Awards steadily breaks viewing figures. But this glosses over several things, the first of which is how many of those viewers are botted. And no, I'm not going to pretend like everyone else that their viewing figures are organic. Bear in mind, I've been in the streaming game since long before Google Video existed, and that predated YouTube for you young'uns out there. And anyone who's been a YouTuber or Twitch streamer for 5 minutes knows that any channel consistently pulling millions of views is being botted. It's an open paid-for service that every major streamer on every major platform ever has used either directly or without their personal knowledge by their agency at least once from day one. Period. Do not debate me on this. The recent controversy with the quartering is an excellent proof case if you want one. So we can immediately strip away at least a third of those viewing figures, and that's being exceedingly conservative, I might add. Now, of those remaining viewers, you'll have a lot of streamers doing watch-alongs in their specific regions, so that takes another hefty chunk off their figures, as those streamers are doing it as part of their content creation, not necessarily because they like or care for Jeff Keighley or his cavalcade of industry bigwigs patting each other on the back. Which brings us to the remaining reviewers, of which over half are almost certainly there merely for the sheer schadenfreude of little Jeffy wheeling out his buddies and desperately trying to shill the latest garbage fire titles from fancy project studios run by centi-billionaires, nepo babies. Once you've broken all that down, then taking a few more viewers off those that couldn't make it to the live event or weren't invited, who just want to support their project or team, or friends of friends of friends, then you're actually looking at a very small number of genuine viewers who are actually there to watch the Game Awards as if it were an actual credible awards show. Again, Laura seems to be under the impression that either Jeff or the Game Awards have ever been credible at any point, which embarrassingly they haven't. That's not to say the Game Awards haven't been influential. To be sure, Jeff has duped plenty of players into parting with their hard-earned cash for the latest slop that the Game Awards has deemed worthy of their tin trinket. But to say that they are at risk of ending up like the Oscars if they keep elevating provably awful games like High Guard is just more fuel to the fire of those questioning Laura's credibility at this late stage of her video. We all knew High Guard was going to fail because Jeff Keighley elevated it on the Game Awards. And when it dropped, it managed to achieve Schrodinger's disappointment by not in any way disappointing on the public's expectations by any means, given its praise from Keighley in the Game Awards, while also disappointing the paid-for Axis journalists and loud minority activist tourists by all means, when it wasn't received by the actual consumer masses as the awesome game Jeff had hyped it up to be at the Game Awards. That disappointment, of course, was aimed from said journalists and tourists towards the consumers, and not Jeff, the Game Awards, or Highguard's developers, mind you. So, Laura's misreading on this point is somewhat confusing, but she then continues, stating that gamers are frustrated with the disparity in reviews, but may also be taking journalist reviews too seriously, particularly when those journalists are cozying up to the developers in ways that would normally have to be declared as conflicts of interest at best, and as fraud red flags at worst. And trust me, I used to have to do annual anti-fraud examinations due to the field I was working in, and gift boxes full of CD players, fingerboards and so on are a definite red flag for fraud, whatever way you cut it. So this obviously damages the credibility of the journalists, publishers and developers, which Laura correctly points out. But then the whole industry inside and out, top to bottom, is riddled with this infection now, and the only way to stop it seems to be to let the whole industry die, so that the phage, with nothing more to feed on, itself perishes. In her final words, Laura goes on to say that she wants to see more projects like Mixtape in the industry, with developers exploring their passion projects and experimenting, but scoping it so that they don't end up with massive layoffs. And apparently we should be celebrating that this studio did it right, even if their game isn't for us. Wait, hold on. You mean just like Crimson Skies wasn't for you, so you added a skip button to make it for you, without much thought to the actual target audience nor the broader impact of such a decision? Or do you mean how Mixtape was a vanity project by a studio based in Melbourne, run by a post-millennial upper-middle-class wannabe 90s grunger with the backing of both Game Pass and the daughter of the third richest man in the world, with money paid up front and access to all possible resources and opportunities, yet shielded from the usual risks, hardships or crunches associated with an under 2-year development cycle for a 12-person team to complete a viable commercial gaming product in this year of our Lord 2026. Only for that title to be a 3-hour stop-motion animated slideshow with none of the mechanics but all of the feels and member berries. I couldn't possibly understand why anyone would find such a title to be not for them, / sarcastic tone. Laura finishes the video with wannabe Kurt answering a question about if they started this project today, would they worry about not getting the backing or funding they needed? Now, I wonder if that interviewer deliberately asked that, knowing that the answer would be what it was. I don't care. We just make what we make. Of course you do, son. Of course you do. Because the third richest man in the world is paying for it, sight unseen, and he can never say no to his little girl. The entitlement is so off the scale with this guy, it makes my skin crawl. And where's that genuine passion of which Laura spoke at the top of her video? How many true indie game developers can be this carefree about where the money's coming from? How many of them are so well off as to be able to fund their own life or even a family over a 2-year development cycle without a full-time job or exterior investment with literally zero care to where that funding comes from, or whether it will continue long enough to see out the project, let alone leave them with any significant personal take-home profits once the whole thing's shipped and selling. I was just talking to Willie Coppin this weekend, star of The Empire Strikes Back, Willow, Neverending Story and so on, and he understands very well the tangible risks, hardships and efforts that independent filmmakers endure. My co-host Neil from our old show on Fluid Vision has just premiered his independent film Best Goo Bren, and that posed tangible risks and challenges over the past couple of years of production for him and his family. Back when I was working with Jackson Pat, those productions were always hanging on a shoestring, requiring lots of extra efforts, extra hours, and counting every penny, every second to ensure we met deadline, on target and on budget. And Jackson went over and above to prepare, pre-plan and scope the projects absolutely to the T. Hence why he went on to work on great films like Ip Man and alongside Jackie Chan in one of his more recent productions. I often compare Jackson Pack to the director in One Cut of the Dead, which is a great film I suggest anyone watches, as it depicts exactly the sort of chaos behind the scenes of a true indie production that is suddenly scooped up by a major network that one expressly sees none of in the presentation of Mixtape, nor those who produced it. I'm not sure of how aware Laura is of Annapurna's background or that of Megan Ellison, nor whether she has any recollection of the fiasco wherein the entire exec branch walked out on Ellison due to differences over the spin-off of Annapurna's gaming segment into a dedicated independent entity. Now, look, I really appreciate every one of you who have made it this far, and I really did not intend for this video to stretch this length. But then Laura had to go and post this about 14 hours before I sat down to write this video, and this is what prompted me to make it. Quote, "I'm surprised by how many comments are saying Mixtape isn't an indie game because of government grants and Annapurna funding. My understanding is that Beethoven and Dinosaur's previous game, The Artful Escape, had the exact same backing. Outer Wilds was also funded by Annapurna. Maybe my definition is off, so I'm curious what you think. How are you defining indie in 2026? I was thinking it was developer size and creative control, not money invested. Thoughts?" Let me just clarify something for those of you that don't know. Laura Fryer was once director of the Xbox Advanced Technology Group, and she led the much-lauded XNA initiative, which was the core indie developer initiative during her tenure at Xbox. So Laura is telling us quite plainly that she headed up the Xbox Indie Developer Initiative whilst having no idea what the definition of an indie developer is? Because let me clarify for everyone here, developer size and creative control does not define an independent game developer by any means, just in the same way that the cost of a product is absolutely no indicator whatsoever towards the quality of said product. Even more telling is that the French developers of HK Project, Blue 12 Studio, were originally a pair of indie developers, formerly of Ubisoft, until April 2017, when they received investment, at which point they were no longer indie. And who provided that investment? Well, Annapurna, who had reached out to them in the previous April of 2016, looking for a really good project that they could use as a turnkey opportunity to boost Annapurna's middling reputation into something somewhat more globally recognized and respected. Kula and Viv accepted their offer, which had forwarded them the funds to build their studio and the publishing framework to get the game out to market under a new title of Stray. That would have then defined Blue 12 as a second party to Annapurna under this sort of arrangement traditionally, given that the entire development of Stray and indeed the building of the studio itself hinged upon Annapurna's continued investment despite creative control remaining with the developers. So this one really bowled me over from Laura to genuinely ask what defines an indie developer, a question coming from the former head of XNA, Xbox's indie developer dedicated initiative. It's unconscionable. It's so wildly beyond reason that I almost choked on my tea. As I have said, often the smartest of us are in some areas the most naive in others. Seemingly obvious, seemingly common sense areas are completely beyond us. It is very clear now how we ended up with so many obviously astroturfed indie, in inverted commas, games flooding the Xbox Live marketplace when the person who led the original Xbox Indie Developer Initiative has never known what actually defines an indie game. So, to be clear, an indie developer is a developer or team of developers who are entirely self-funded with no external investment, whereas a studio with private external investment from, say, a centibillionaire is definitely not an indie developer. I also have further news for you because unfortunately the indie scene has long been a right place for obfuscated funding and rampant money laundering. Just look at the millions in funding misappropriated by the games industry from the UK government under David Cameron's drive for homegrown British developers. It all ended up getting hoovered up by EA, Sony, Sega, Nintendo and Crytek, the latter of whom shut down Free Radical and moved all their operations out of the country, costing all the jobs at the studio and robbing the UK of another homegrown grassroots British developer. David Cameron's government initiative expressly funded the wholesale offshoring and the bulk of Britain's game development to Bulgaria, India and beyond, leaving thousands out of work across the UK industry. And more recently, the UK government funded the development of the widely memed and streamed Amelia State propaganda game, which backfired so stunningly that it has grown into its own monster that the incumbent government cannot surmount. So, everyone must really try their hardest not to believe the overnight success stories of supposedly indie anythings. They are almost all 100% constructed narratives, but by whichever marketing team has been assigned to that product once said product has been signed on to the big leagues, so to speak. It has been a successful technique of the film and music industries since the likes of Charlie Chaplin or Frank Sinatra, and continues to work on the more easily led consumers of the video games industry today. Just remember Peter Moore's outlook and method. He rode the times of big brands battling it out. Corpos ruled the roost then. People loved ploughing their money into either Nike or Reebok, Pepsi or Coke, Nintendo or Sega. He brought that to the next gen with Xbox versus PlayStation, and over time, as the corpos fell out of favour, it became all about the rise of the underdogs, the indies, or the perception thereof. And as Vince McMahon always says, perception is reality. So now it's all presented as a battle between corporate multinationals versus plucky upstart indies. Except all the indies are actually backdoor funded by centibillionaires and shady government social think tanks. This is a very long video, I know, but I hope this explains somewhat where people are coming from with their criticisms of Laura's commentary. What do you all think about this out there? Let me know in the comments if you think I'm being balanced and reasonable about this, or whether you think I'm just gassing on and being too hard on Laura. And to Laura, I genuinely look forward to perhaps a follow-up video addressing the responses you've had and what you feel may be prompting such a visceral reaction. Has anything I said here particularly struck a chord with you, or conversely, have I irredeemably offended you to the point where you'll no longer reply to my comments with your usual cool, logical and analytical insights? Let me reiterate, I still have huge respect for Laura, and she still ranks in my top 10 women gaming, right up there with Roberta Williams, Amy Hennig, Jane Jensen, Lorelei Shannon. I could easily go on. Our points of disagreement, though, are of a great deal more interest than those upon which we agree. And it's only through discussing and analysing these instances openly that either side can render a happy and reasonable resolution. So I genuinely hope that this can further a further discussion, a deeper discussion on the issues at hand, not just within the context of Mixtape, but in the broader context of what the mixtape controversy reveals about the weakened state of the industry at large. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Bye bye now.